Well, let's speak now to Craig Singleton, a national security expert and former US diplomat who's a senior China fellow at the Foundation for the Defence of Democracies. Mr. Singleton, thank you for joining us here on BBC World News. It was something of a marathon conversation by all accounts, 2 hours and 17 minutes. Do we take it from this that the Biden administration didn't exactly condone the prospect of Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan?
Thank you for having me. I would say overall the call went about as well as the two sides could have hoped, although expectations were generally pretty low at the call's outset that there would be any sort of a major diplomatic breakthrough. Perhaps the biggest takeaway is that President Biden and Xi Jinping are possibly planning to meet face-to-face, which would be their first face-to-face meeting as early as this fall in Bali during the G20 Leaders Summit. I think that the call in general is really part of a White House-led effort to ensure that the intensified competition between the United States and China doesn't veer into the military domain. And so they see these leader-to-leader exchanges as vital to that effort, and that includes being able to have very frank discussions about Taiwan.
It's a hard sell, though, isn't it, for an American president to seek to persuade his Chinese counterpart that there is no change in US-China and US-Taiwan policy, given that a senior member of his very own party is planning to do something which the Chinese regard as quite absurdly provocative.
Absolutely. I mean, China's clear hostility regarding Speaker Pelosi's planned trip is by and large very consistent with what we've seen from Beijing in terms of its rhetoric and its broader efforts to diplomatically isolate the self-governing island nation. The trip also happens to coincide with the 75th anniversary of the founding of China's People's Liberation Army, which is, of course, a sensitive moment. And as you mentioned, there is deep skepticism in Beijing about American guarantees that this trip and others like it don't signify a change in U.S. policy. And that is made all the more difficult because President Biden himself has consistently mischaracterized American security commitments under the Taiwan Relations Act here in the United States. But at the end of the day, there is no indication at this point that China is preparing for any sort of imminent invasion on Taiwan, and nor is there any information to suggest that they are thinking about a serious military escalation in response to Nancy Pelosi's possible plans to travel there.
But what action could Beijing actually take if Nancy Pelosi decides to press ahead with this trip to Taiwan?
Sure. I mean, Speaker Pelosi's trip is obviously not happening in a vacuum, and the White House has made clear that it has major reservations about her trip and the plans, simply because they could disrupt other parts of the very complex, multifaceted relationship that exists between the U.S. and China. There is precedent for Nancy Pelosi's trip. Back in the 1990s, former Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich traveled to Taiwan, but that was during a very different period in U.S.-China relations when things were relatively positive, and that's obviously just not the case today. Should Nancy Pelosi travel to Taiwan, I think what we're going to see quite immediately will be an increase in Chinese air defense incursions around Taiwan. And we may even see a provocative act like something called a median line incursion. And that's when Chinese aircraft would breach the maritime border that is in the median of the Taiwan Strait.
Mr. Singleton, we must leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.